When and how should you end a podcast? Welcome to the Audacity to Podcast, episode 235. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Audacity to Podcast. I'm Daniel J. Lewis, and this is the award-winning how-to podcast about podcasting. It's where I give you the guts and teach you the tools to launch or improve your own podcast for sharing your passions and finding success. One of the things that we'll run into as podcasters is that time when we're thinking, should I end this show? Should I stop doing this particular podcast? Maybe start a different one? Maybe stop podcasting altogether? And that's that point that I want to explore in this episode, number 235 of the Audacity to Podcast. When should you end a podcast? And if you decide to end a podcast, how should you end that podcast? I've got a few points on each of these and some tips to help you decide when and how to end a podcast. And you can follow along in the show notes at theaudacitytopodcast.com/end. The main purpose here is for you to avoid pod fading. This is when your podcast fades from existence. You don't say anything, you don't tell anyone the podcast is ending, but you find yourself no longer having as much time to host the podcast. You're not putting out episodes as frequently as you used to. The content may be slipping, the production quality may be slipping, anything like that may be slipping, and the podcast just fades into oblivion. You don't want to do that. What would be good is to end a podcast. Many things do have to come to an end. In fact, everything comes to an end at some point. So you just have to decide when that end is for your podcast. I'm not saying you have to decide that right now, that you're only going to do so many episodes and then end. You can do that, certainly. You can decide to do that. That's totally okay. But I do highly recommend that you not let your podcast fade into oblivion, but that you intentionally end it when it's the right time. So when is the right time to end a podcast? I've got 4 tips to help you figure that out. And before I go through these 4 tips, consider that these are general guidelines and you should only consider ending when these 4 things, or some of these, or all of them, are true regularly. If you feel at one moment like, oh, I don't know what to talk about, or my passion for this project is gone, or whatever negative feeling you have about your podcast, because you feel that doesn't mean that you should end the podcast at that time. It just means you're having a down day. We all have down days. There are days when I come to the Audacity to Podcast and I think, oh, I don't want to work on a podcast today. I want to do this other new thing like Podcaster Society, which I'm really loving Podcaster Society. Register for the free webinar, by the way, because registration is closed at this time, but it will be reopened for only 36 hours when Mignon Fogarty, better known as Grammar Girl, joins me for a webinar on September 24th, 2015. But you can always register for whatever the latest webinar is and check on the status of the registration over at podcastersociety.com. But getting back to this, when should you end a podcast? Well, number 1, when you run out of content. There are some podcasts that have limited material. Maybe your purpose of your podcast is to speak to the top 10 people who are known for something in particular. So after you talk to those top 10 people, do you need to continue podcasting? Maybe not. Maybe you run out of content because the thing you podcast about doesn't have content anymore. For example, TV show fan podcasts will run into this. At some point, a TV show will be ended. We have 2 podcasts on Noodle Mix Network that are now for ended TV shows. Resurrection Revealed, hosted by Wayne Henderson and Troy Heinrichs, ended earlier this year because the TV show was canceled. It had a great following, but they canceled the TV show. Unfortunate ending, but the podcast ended as well. And the other podcast that Wayne and Troy host on Noodle Mix Network is Under the Dome Radio, and that has just officially ended this last weekend in mid-September 2015 because CBS ended the TV show Under the Dome. And I know a lot of fans were glad for the TV show to end. But regardless, the show is over, so there's no need to continue the podcast. So when you run out of content like that, maybe it's time to officially end the podcast. There could still be things you could talk about, like maybe interviewing cast members or sharing certain news or a review of the DVDs or Blu-rays or something like that, some extra content that you could have afterward. But usually when the content runs dry, your podcast is going to run dry, and that might be a good time for you to end the podcast. That's number one, when you run out of content. Number two, when you lose the passion. I know you've probably heard the word passion so much in the context of podcasting that you're sick and tired of hearing people talk about passion. Passion is important in podcasting because we are communicating with our voices. So our passion or lack of passion will show in your voice. Certainly, there are cases where you are hired to do a podcast for someone and your passion isn't as necessary in those cases. Sometimes you can fake it. Sometimes you can do a business style passion because you're passionate about getting paid for the podcast that you're hosting. So that's your passion, not necessarily the content that you actually podcast about. But when you lose a passion for a project you're doing because you're passionate about it, that might be a good time to end the podcast. Otherwise, people are going to notice how much you don't like doing what you're continuing to force yourself to do. That's number two, when you lose the passion. Number three, when you need to make room for something else. Life changes. And it's not always that something gets in the way of the podcast, but sometimes it's simply that you get more interested in something else. So unless you have some kind of commitment to fulfill with your podcast, like you promised so many episodes, or you promised to see a season through on the TV show, or you have a contract to do so many episodes or have so many sponsorship spots or anything like that, if you don't have any kind of commitment to fulfill, there's nothing wrong with ending your podcast in order to free up your time for something else. That something else could be your family. It could be a new job. It could be a different podcast that you want to launch. Maybe you've decided this particular podcast and this subject you were podcasting about was your passion for a while, but now you're really excited about this new thing. So you end the podcast that you were working on. So now you can use that time to focus on the new thing that you want to cover. That's number three, when you need to make room for something else. And number four, when you've tried everything else. Whether the work is too hard, you're not reaching your goals, or whatever other reason you have, make sure you don't jump too quickly into quitting. Yes, it is important to quit quickly, but don't jump to quitting as your first resort. That might be your last resort in some cases. I've done several episodes in the past to help you keep podcasting, and I've got a list of these in the show notes for episode 235 at theaudacitytopodcast.com/end. For example, 7 free and easy ways to give your podcast new life. 5 reasons your podcast audience isn't growing. 7 ways to make podcasting fun. 5 steps to an unstoppable vision for your blog or podcast. And here's one that doesn't start with a number. How to prevent pod fading and podcasting burnout. In these episodes that I've shared, and the links are in the show notes for this episode, I give a bunch of tips for things you can do to keep you podcasting or give you new energy for your podcast or to improve certain aspects or simplify aspects of your podcast. When you have tried all of these other things and stuff still isn't working for you, like you're still not passionate, you're still not having fun, you're still not finding content to talk about, then it might be time to end your podcast. So these 4 things to tell you when it might be time to end your podcast are: number 1, when you run out of content. Number 2, when you lose the passion. Number 3, when you need to make room for something else. And number 4, when you've tried everything else. When these are true, then it might be time to end your podcast. And remember, not just when these are true on one particular day, but on a regular basis. Do you feel like you don't have anything to talk about? Do you feel often that you don't have any passion for this? Have you tried everything else and it's still not working for you? You've given it the time and the effort. then it might be time to end your podcast. So if you've decided to end your podcast, now how do you do that well? Because again, you don't want to pod fade and just slowly fade into oblivion or disappear and people wondering, what happened to that podcast? Are you coming back? And you get bombarded with messages. Someone from Podcaster Society, because I ran this idea past some of them before I recorded, someone there, Emily from Classy Little Podcast, said that she has a podcast that's years old and people to this day are still finding her and asking about the podcast because the original podcast back then wasn't necessarily ended in a particular way, or people didn't understand that the podcast is over now. So here are 4 tips for how to end a podcast. Number 1, be intentional. Or in other words, don't pod fade. Pod fading is when your podcast slowly dies because you're not being intentional. You're not working on the podcast. You're not putting out episodes. You're not clearly saying the podcast is ending. You're not following a particular plan. It just is slowly dying. Like I had a parakeet one time, my second parakeet. I loved my first parakeet, but my second parakeet died because I didn't feed it. And I didn't feed it because I wasn't as engaged with this parakeet because it wasn't the same one as before. I even named it the same thing as my first parakeet, but I wasn't as interested in that parakeet and I was forgetting to feed it. Don't forget to feed your podcast or it might end up dying on you. But be intentional about ending your podcast. Maybe you decide to have a big finale, a party, a live show. You take live call-ins or you wrap up with some of your best content ever or anything special like that. It would be better to end the podcast in a way that makes people think, boy, I wish that podcast wasn't over, than for people to think, oh man, am I glad that podcast is over and gone. Boy, did I hate that show. And man, the way they ended it was absolutely horrible. Don't be that kind of podcast or that kind of TV show like Under the Dome was, but be the type that people continue to think about how amazing the ending was and that they miss the show. Simply because they miss your show doesn't mean you should bring it back. It's really up to you. And I'll mention more about bringing your show back in a moment. But the whole point here is to be deliberate and intentional and finish well. Like in a race, a marathon. You don't have to race the whole way through and run with all of your might the whole way through. Sometimes merely finishing is a major accomplishment for you. But during those last several yards, boy, that's the time that you want to run and cross that finish line running with your hands up in the air like you just do not care and running across that line, finishing the race no matter how long it took you to get there. Finish your podcast well. Be intentional in ending it. That's number 1. Number 2, tell your audience. This is part of being intentional. Communicate what you're doing or what you plan to do. Don't leave your audience wondering when or if your podcast will continue. If you intend to end it, then tell them that you intend to end it. If a particular episode is the last episode, and you intend it to be that way until further notice, tell them that this is the last episode. It's great to tell them ahead of time that your podcast is going to be ending, so that way some of your audience can have time to send in that last feedback they wanted to be sure that you got, or send in that story or suggest something or anything like that, so they can feel like, oh, I didn't miss my opportunity. I still have a chance to be part of this. You get that when you let them know ahead of time that you are going to end the podcast. That could be 3 episodes, 4 episodes, 10 episodes ahead of time. It could be even from the very beginning. If you say, when the show ends, we'll end the podcast. Or after we cover all 100 points, then we'll end the podcast. You can do it whichever way works best for you. But the important thing is to tell your audience so your audience knows what to expect. This is part of finishing well as well. And don't take this last episode as an opportunity to complain, because that does not reflect well on you. If you got into podcasting to try to build your business, it reflects very badly on your business principles if at the end of your podcast you start complaining about what it didn't accomplish for you, or you start complaining against people or your co-hosts or the audience. Oh, that would be really horrible to complain against the people who are listening to your last episode. Don't be negative in this last episode. Be positive. Make sure that people want you to come back. Even if you never do come back with the podcast, you want them to want you to come back and not to feel like, yeah, you should have ended because, man, you are horrible. You are so negative. I'm surprised you carried the podcast this far. This is all about the legacy that you leave. And don't make a legacy of your problems. Make a legacy of your decisions to follow success and the positivity that you leave your audience, the positive impact that you make. So this is number 2, tell your audience. Number 3 tip to ending your podcast well. Keep the podcast online. Even though you may stop actively podcasting and you may not even care about the topic anymore, your show could still have plenty of value to the current audience, as well as many people who may years from now find that podcast. They could still benefit from it. Unless your podcast is very time-based, most likely there's still some benefit to it. If it's a TV show fan podcast, for my Once Upon a Time podcast, and Once Upon a Time is just starting its 5th season, there are people who are still finding the show for the first time and listening to our podcasts back from season 1. It's still timeless to them because they're discovering the show and they're discovering our podcast along with it. So I recommend that you leave your podcast online for as long as possible, especially if you have timeless content. Yes, this does mean some ongoing expenses like continuing to renew your domains, website hosting, media hosting, but many times these costs can be reduced or merged in certain ways so that you're not paying as much for a retired show as you were for an active show. For example, with Blueberry or Libsyn, who offer a certain amount of storage space you can upload to per month, when you no longer need to upload new episodes, you could downgrade your account to the cheapest plan that they have and then not upload anything more. There is even a specific tag you can put in your RSS feed to tell iTunes this podcast is over. The necessity of that tag may or may not be really that important, but iTunes probably works with that tag in certain ways to know, stop expecting new episodes from this feed. And that might affect your ranking in iTunes. I can't really know for sure because Apple doesn't share all of these algorithms with us. But do consider keeping your entire catalog of all of your episodes online in the RSS feed and downloadable through iTunes and all of the other podcast apps so that your legacy of that content will continue. If I stopped hosting the Audacity to podcast, I would still continue making money from the products and affiliate links and services and everything else that I recommend through several episodes of the Audacity to podcast. But if I deleted my entire archive, my business would basically shut down. So keeping the podcast online helps not only you, if you're trying to build a platform or build a business, make money, anything like that, but it also helps the world. Because if your podcast content is beneficial to the world, keep it online so that they can continue to benefit with that from generation to generation. I even recommend that you put in your will or set up a trust that will pay for your media hosting and podcast hosting expenses, or that you have some kind of plan in place for if something were to happen to you, that the podcast can continue to remain online. I have something like that. I have a document, this seems really morbid, but I have a document from my wife that basically says, if I die, here's all the stuff that I want you to do. Like get this person to help you turn off such and such, or to help keep my podcast online, or migrate it over to this, tell these people, announce in this place that this is shutting down, keep this online because this becomes passive income and it doesn't need any more maintenance, stuff like that. But one of those things is keep my podcast online. I won't care after I'm dead if the podcast is online, but I think you might care. And other people who want to learn that information that is timeless, I think they'll care. If absolutely necessary, you could migrate your media to something like archive.org and move your website to something like wordpress.com, both completely free. Not ideal, but they can work. They're certainly not ideal for running your podcast for free from the beginning, because that's kind of not the way archive.org is intended. But if you are ending your podcast and you still want to keep it online, archive.org could be great for that. WordPress.com is free. That way your podcast can stay online for free, but you don't have a fully controlled, optimized platform like you would if you maintain your regular websites. So this is number 3, keep your podcast online. Number 4, be open to returning. Think about what would make you resume this podcast. Would it be if you receive a certain number of donations, a certain amount of feedback, if you have extra time to come back to the podcast, or if the TV series returns in some way? For example, Heroes is coming back with Heroes Reborn, and there could be some other Star Trek series to join the Star Trek TV show franchise. So don't completely give up, but be open to returning. And if it's something like when you have extra time, or when you shift jobs, or when something else happens, you could let your audience know, but don't get their hopes up. End the podcast, tell them, this is the end. I may someday bring it back, but otherwise assume this is the end. If you want to keep up with me, follow me in this other place so that you can connect with your audience then. That way, if you decide to bring it back, or if you decide to launch something new, you have some audience ready to give you some leverage for launching that thing well. So that's number 4, be open to return. So how do you know when to end a podcast? Number 1, when you run out of content. Number 2, when you lose the passion. Number 3, when you need to make room for something else. And number 4, when you've tried everything else. And if you've decided to end your podcast, how should you end it? Number 1, be intentional. Number 2, tell your audience. Number 3, keep the podcast online. And number 4, be open to returning. When do you think you should end a podcast? And how do you think you should end it? Have you ever ended a podcast before? I'd love to know why you ended that podcast, how you ended it, and what some of your thoughts are if there's a podcast you listen to that either intentionally ended or podfaded. Please comment on the show notes for episode 235 at theaudacitytopodcast.com/end. Big thanks to a couple people who left some kind reviews for the Audacity to Podcast in iTunes. If you'd like to be one of them, the iTunes link is on the website at theaudacitytopodcast.com. Becca Lewis, who is not related to me, but is in Podcasters Society, said, "Wow, so helpful. I ended up buying one of his courses and just worked my way through what he said. Much easier than listening to a ton of opinions." Thank you very much, Becca, for sharing that. Homeschooled Nerd said, "As a podcaster, I found this podcast very helpful. Daniel has some great advice, and I even learned a lot from episodes that I listened to, which I thought wouldn't apply to me. It just packs so much content in each episode." Well, thank you very much, Homeschooled Nerd. I got to be on his podcast recently as well. I send those links out, by the way, to my email list when I'm on a podcast, and I share them on social networks as well. If you'd like to leave a review for the Audacity to Podcast, I would really appreciate it because it encourages me and it helps other people find the podcast as well. So go to theaudacitytopodcast.com and click on the iTunes or Stitcher buttons there to write a review. And of course, if you're not subscribed, then subscribe so you receive every episode automatically. If you want your podcast reviews emailed to you automatically, like I have for my own podcast, so I can see Monday morning, oh, these are my new reviews, then go to mypodcastreviews.com. This is the official sponsor for the International Podcast Day Gratitude Award, which is still accepting nominations. You can check that out and much more about International Podcast Day at internationalpodcastday.com. There are going to be a lot of awesome things going on September 30th and leading up to September 30th. So much that I can't tell you all here, and we couldn't even fit it into an episode we did recently. But check it all out at internationalpodcastday.com. Please comment on the show notes for this episode at theaudacitytopodcast.com/end. Now that I've given you some of the guts and taught you some of the tools, it's time for you to go launch or improve your own podcast for sharing your passions and finding success. I'm Daniel J. Lewis from theaudacitytopodcast.com. Thanks for listening. The Audacity to Podcast is a proud member of Noodle Mix Network. Find more of our award-winning and award-nominated podcasts to make you think, laugh, and succeed at noodle.mx. The Audacity to Podcast is also a